Hey guys, hope you're doing well. Hope you're taking care of yourself and your families. Um, just make sure you're taking care of yourself and make sure you're getting outside every once in a while and getting some sun and getting some exercise, but of course staying away from people because that's the most important thing right now is take care of yourself. Um, with that being said, though, we want to still help you in school, obviously, so I'm going to be recording these lectures for you. I tried doing it on PowerPoint. It didn't really work. Like the file size was huge. So I'm just going to make these and put them on YouTube instead. And you guys, they'll be there for you. You can watch them at your leisure. Um, so it's there. Um, Make sure you guys are checking out the calendar through Canvas, looking at your weekly, what you have to do. And let me know if you got any questions. I got my WebEx meeting every morning. I have you can send me a message through email, through Canvas, however you want to try to contact me. I'm here, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. So, yeah, just take care of yourself and do what you can when you can do it. And let me know if you have any questions. So, we're looking at imperialism today. Hopefully, something that you remember a little bit from American history. When America engaged in imperialism in places like Alaska, Hawaii, the Caribbean, the Pacific with the Philippines. But we're looking at European imperialism, which actually happened first. The Europeans were doing it first, and the Americans had to kind of play catch up. And just as America went to places by Hawaii, Alaska, and the Caribbean, Europe's going to do the same. And the places close to Europe, where Africa and Asia, specifically China and India, we'll look at. Now, Europe had been in Africa for a while, and we talked about this with exploration, the slave trade. But as you can see in the map of 1880 there, not a huge presence, and pretty much just on the peripheries, just on the kind of the exterior coastal regions of Africa. I never really went too much inside. A couple of reasons for that. One, they didn't really have a reason to. They were interested in Africa for the slaves. Those were brought to them to the coast from the interior. And so all they had to do is kind of just wait, and slaves were brought in, they make their trade, they take the slaves over to the New World. Also, it was very difficult. Africa's huge. It's an enormous continent, and it has all these various different climate zones, because it's very long north to south. So as you go north to south, you get all these different coastal regions as you go closer to and then further away from the equator. So it's really difficult. And there's people there, people that would have resisted European encroachment. This wasn't like the New World, North and South America, where ahead of the Europeans marched a wave of disease that decimated the North and South American indigenous peoples. So that made European conquest much, much, much easier. Africans had, because they had a measure of exposure to Europeans, throughout their history, they had a measure of immunity to European diseases as well. So it wasn't nearly as devastating, which is the whole reason why the Europeans wanted Africans as slaves, because they knew they were resistant to the diseases as the people of the New World weren't. However, though, you can see in the map on the right, 30 years after, Europe was everywhere. Europe controlled essentially the entire continent in one way or shape or the other, particularly France and the United Kingdom. So what changed? How do we go from Europe being there but not really, really involved in the continent to controlling the whole thing? There's a couple of reasons why the Europeans kind of changed their attitude when it came to Africa, the reasons why they're going to engage in this process of imperialism. And a lot of it's based on the Industrial Revolution. So with the Industrial Revolution, now you have the capability of manufacturing huge quantities of products. You have the kind of beginning growth of the middle class. You have the capability of these factories to create a lot of products that people want to buy. And to create the product, you need some sort of a raw resource. And the Europeans had some resources there, but they also wanted to create other products, and so they had to go out to other places in the world to find those resources to create those products. Okay, so this demand for natural resources, and Africa had a lot of those tropical hardwoods, rubber, gold, diamonds, a large supply of the diamonds that come from African mines The crown jewels of the Queen of England basically all came from Africa. So they really wanted those products or those resources to create the products. And then once they had the resources put into the factories to create the finished products, well, now if you're a business, you make money by selling those products. And the more places your country has overseas, the more areas of influence, the more potential customers. So yeah, you're going to sell it directly in Europe itself, but the more places you have, the more potential, again, buyers you have. So you wanted those overseas markets to sell those finished products as well. And as European nations went through an industrial revolution and became powerful, even more so than they already were, they looked to build on that prestige. And this scramble from overseas colonies was driven by that European competition that had existed for centuries and centuries. And also technology advanced to a point where it was possible. Travel was much faster with steamships, with trains, like way faster, and made now trips back and forth to Africa and into the African interior once those train tracks were laid, much more feasible. And the weapon technology even continued to grow. The Europeans had a gun advantage, but now this wasn't just single shot smoothbore muskets. These were rifles carrying multiple shots, even machine guns. As we approached the 20th century. So the weapons gap had just grown that much more in favor of the Europeans, and there wasn't a whole lot the Africans could do to resist them. So what basically happens, and I said scramble for it, it's literally called the scramble for Africa. European nations start going and gobbling up as much African territory as they can. And initially it's not too big of a deal because there's a lot of land to go around. But eventually those borders start to kind of rub up against one another. They're running out of free room, and everything's kind of getting taken. So now we have a little friction because now we have borders touching, and it's like, I own this, no, I own this, and there's a potential for war in Europe. So to avoid this, a conference is called. The major European leaders go and they meet. It's in Berlin, as you see the Berlin Conference. And just as the cartoon suggests, they basically carve up the cake. Now they take Africa and they say, all right, you get this, and you get that, and you get this, and you get that, and just divide it up amongst the European countries, which in the short term is going to release that tension, that the people there are like, okay, this is cool, and everything's fine in Europe for the time being. It will eventually lead to some tension down the road. We're talking about World War I next, and imperialism is one of the causes of World War I. As some of the countries were okay at first, like Germany specifically, they got a smaller piece of the pie, but they weren't that powerful yet. They were a newer country. But as we get into the 20th century and stuff, we're like, hey, we're pretty strong now. We want more of that territory. We're no longer happy. And that's one of the reasons the war is going to break out. However, no Africans are present at this. The Europeans didn't care about the Africans. They didn't care about pre-existing cultural groups and economic groups and pre-existing kingdoms. They just carved it up. Water tables, the way that this continent had functioned, they just said, nope, we're carving it up. So you can imagine if the opposite had happened. If Africans had gone into Europe and taken like half of France and half of Germany and be like, all right, you're together now. Too bad if you don't like each other, get along. And that's basically what happens in Africa. So these groups are like, oh, by the way, you're this now. They weren't happy with that, obviously. They didn't get along. And that's going to lead to a lot of problems down the road. And the Europeans are going to go in and they just tear Africa up. They rip out all the mineral wealth, all the resources. The native people are exploited. They're not technically slaves. They're not the Latin term de jure, of law slaves, but they are de facto slaves, of fact slaves. So they're not like legally owned. Slavery is technically illegal at this time, but the way they're treated, they're in every sense slaves. Just exploited for their labor to get those resources out of Africa back to Europe as fast as possible. Now, some people who look back and essentially try to claim that imperialism, wasn't that bad, point to the fact that Europeans built improvements, which is true. They built railroad tracks to increase movement around Africa. They built hospitals and schools. But those improvements weren't built for the Africans. They were built for the Europeans. Yes, they built train tracks. They built train tracks from the mines to the coast to get stuff out as fast as possible. They weren't like connecting cities to facilitate, economic development of Africans. It was how you get stuff out as fast as possible. They built schools to teach African children to be European. Hey, learn French. Forget your native language. Learn French, be Christian, which if that's your choice, fine, but this wasn't something that was asked. This was forced upon them. Which is why if you go to Africa today, there's many parts of Africa that speak European languages because that was forced on them during this colonial time, and they didn't have a say in the matter. So that made them easier to control. Like, hey, you're part of France now, so just do what we say. Or we're part of England now, just do what we say. And to kind of forget your native heritage and languages and religion and that kind of stuff. So yeah, improvements were made, but they're not improvements for the sake of Africans. They were for the sake of Europeans instead. This is King Leopold of Belgium. And Belgium is a very, very tiny country in in Europe, that controlled a huge chunk of Middle Africa called the Congo. In fact, let me go back real quick. This is the Belgian flag right there. Hopefully you can see the mouse as I'm putting over. But right in the center of that big, huge, black, yellow, and orange kind of vertical flag in the middle there, that's the Belgian flag, and that's the area of Africa the Belgians controlled, called the Belgian Congo. Way, way bigger than the actual country of Belgium itself. Belgium is a tiny country in Europe, but the Congo is huge. And King Leopold, as the King of Belgium, basically owned the Congo, like, personally. Like, it was his personal property. And terrible stuff happens all over Africa with imperialism, but it's particularly infamous in the Congo region. Some pictures from the Congo region, people were, mistreated. You see the people there and slaves. Now, I would have showed you this picture in class and asked you, is there anything that, kind of stands out to you or whatever this picture? And inevitably, I was doing this in years past, someone looks at the guards on the ends and be like, hey, the guards are African too. And so basically what happened was, Belgium's a tiny country, and all the countries of Europe didn't want to devote their armies to being in Africa. They wanted them, in Europe in case they needed them. And so what they did was they empowered Africans. They go saying like, you, and you, like, you're in charge, and you get to oversee all the other people and so on. So, and kids, do you have a problem with that? Would you do that if someone came into to Arizona, to Mesa, whatever, and said, you guys are in charge and the rest of you were all slaves? Would you essentially betray your countrymen? And quite frankly, the answer that history tells us is, yeah, you would. When it's a choice of, all right, you can either be a slave or in charge, and not a slave, and not just you, but your whole family. So you're not just worrying about yourself. It's like what your kids and so on. You're going to take that deal. Not everyone did probably, but most people did. So they would empower certain Africans to rule over the others, and that's going to it still has drastic consequences in Africa today. You can see the hunger, the starvation, and these photos are very, very stark. So one of the punishment methods that was used in the Congo was amputation. So if you were a worker, you had like a certain quota of rubber was a big export, like you had to collect a certain amount. And if you didn't, you might have an arm amputated. You might cut it off. To which you would say, why would you do that? Like that, now that worker only has one hand, so they're not nearly as effective as they might have been before. But if you have 100 workers and you cut off the hand of one of them, yes, you've made that one worker no longer as efficient, but now everyone else they know, like, this is what's going to happen to me if I don't produce as fast as I can, or as fast as they needed me to, because they probably were going as fast as they could, but they were expected to go faster. And so that's what they did. These photographs were actually taken by a British journalist who, like, this is before social media, the internet and stuff. So it's like there were like rumors about stuff that was going on, but there was no confirmation, and the Belgians tried to kind of keep it on the down low. So this guy basically smuggled himself in, took pictures, and you can see these are photo ops. You can see the white sheets that the photographer put on them to put their limbs on, so you can see the clear contrast between the dark and the white there. And then smuggled them back to Europe and released them. People were like, oh my god, and they were shocked. And you can imagine, like, you know, we've seen a lot in through the internet, and like movies have really realistic and graphic stuff and whatever. You've learned about the Holocaust before, so you've seen images of that. Like, people at this time had never seen anything like this. Like, you've never seen someone with their hand cut off. So these were really shocking, stark images that the people of Europe saw, and there was a lot of backlash, and King Leopold actually forced to give up personal possession. Like, Belgium still controlled it. There were still atrocities that were committed, but he was forced to give up personal possession. Now, speaking of the Holocaust, I talked about that. The Holocaust is something called a genocide. And a genocide is the purposeful attempt at extermination of a certain group of people. Ethnic groups, religious groups, like whatever you're specifically targeting. The Holocaust is the largest, most well-known example of a Holocaust, especially in the 21st century. But not the only one. There was another one in the 90s, early 90s, called the Rwandan genocide, that you may have heard about before. But the Rwandan genocide, and there's a great movie called Hotel Rwanda you can watch about it, was a direct result of European imperialism. So in the Congo, which the Congo region is eventually going to turn into a couple countries once Belgium leaves, and one of those is Rwanda. Basically, they created two groups. Like I said, they empower some Africans to rule, those that looked the most European, essentially, and they called them the Tutsis. And everyone else who worked were called the Hutus. So the Tutsis had power, and the Hutus were ruled over. And the Tutsis abused their power, and in some cases mistreated the Hutus. And this went on for decades and decades and decades, and the Hutus massively came to resent the Tutsis. Okay, but there's a lot more Hutus than Tutsis. You know, they were the massive workforce, and the Tutsis were the small elite that kind of ruled. Well, fast forward after World War II, Belgium leaves the Congo. And now they just kind of like leave, like, all right, we're out of here, you guys figure it out. And countries like Rwanda become created, and now everyone's on equal footing. And essentially Rwanda comes into like essentially a democracy. And the Hutus, since they were the massive group, they had the power, and they had a lot of bitter feelings and resentment. And that boiled and boiled and boiled in Rwanda for a long time, and eventually is going to explode into what we call the Rwandan genocide, where Hutus are going to lash out at Tutsis and Hutus that try to protect them or whatever, and slaughter them. This was brutal stuff. This was neighbors going against neighbors and dragging them out of their houses and hacking them to pieces with machetes and hatchets and stuff. This was just a release of pent-up anger and frustration and stuff on the Tutsis. And a lot of people died. The exact numbers, but I think, hundreds, 600, 700,000 people died in a very, very short amount of time, just like about a month or so. So it was brutal, and some pictures from and this was, by the way, the Holocaust happened in the 40s, and there's always kind of like, what's going on? Is it really happening? Is it not? But this was the 90s. This was like CNN, like, had reporters there live on the scene, like the whole world was watching this happen as it happened, and basically did nothing to stop it. These are the remains of people at a church that the Tutsis had fled to seek refuge during the genocide, and the Hutu extremists went in and hacked into pieces. And you can see on the skulls the fractures and stuff of the trauma that the people endured as they were killed. So the Rwandan genocide basically was a direct result of European imperialism. That we went in, the Europeans went in, they tore stuff up. They took all the wealth out, they changed all the cultures, and then they just left. And so that's the end. We'll talk about Asian imperialism actually in a different video. I don't want this to go on for too long. But Africa is, a continent that most Americans, if you ask them, like, do you want to live in Africa, would say no. That's partly born out of ignorance, but it's a continent that's gone through a lot of problems, and it's getting better. All the countries in Africa, the people people have been living in Africa like forever, like that's the origin of the human species. But the countries are basically pretty much newly created once the Europeans left in the 1960s, and they're going through growing pains. The same way that America did. America had a lot of problems with slavery, and we had the Civil War thing, and we're better 200 years later. Well, the African countries haven't been around for just a couple decades. So Africa's had a lot of problems it's gone through. They're working their way through it, and they're trending in the right direction. If we fast forward 100 years from now, countries in Africa might be considered some of the best countries in the world. So the kind of the modern day Africa is still dealing with the problems created by European imperialism. So that's it for this one, guys. I'll put out this as soon as possible, and then start on the imperialism one as well, or the imperialism in Asia as well. So hope you guys are doing well.